Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 12th of August 2022, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, myself, Brian Gerrish. Be delighted to have Patrick Henningsen with me here in the studio. And we're also going to be joined by Vanessa Beeley on live link. And we're very pleased to have Debbie Evans joining us as well today. Very hot.
Scorcher.
Scorcher. We're going to say beautiful weather. So despite all of the notices over the motorways to watch out for your journey, make sure you can survive as you travel from Birmingham to Plymouth. We're going to enjoy the weather. But of course, if you've got some water with you, that's always a good idea. Well, we're going to kick off with an update on Ukraine. Still a very cruel war that's going on. You produced an excellent graphic here. Patrick, just open us into Ukraine.
Sure. Well, this is an update on the situation in Ukraine right now. Now, the big story Brian's going to be commenting on in a minute to see what the leading NATO countries are saying. But it was this, Russian military comments on Crimean blasts. And this is what the Russian government or the MOD is saying. Moscow stated that no one has been injured in the explosion and that none of the aviation equipment at the airfield, Saki airfield in Crimea here, was damaged by the blasts. Now, granted, Brian, in war, everything is propaganda, so all sides are going to be keeping their cards close to their chest. They're maybe going to be putting stuff out in public that might not be true. We don't know the full extent either way. It's very difficult to determine. Yeah. So we are very skeptical about all sides, Russian side and every side, in terms of getting close to the facts. But we can triangulate what we think might likely be happening.
Well, we can. Probably we're not going to triangulate very well, though, if we're going to the UK Ministry of Defence, but we think we should go there. I'd just like to point out, as a former serviceman myself, that I find it astonishing that our national flag takes a almost minuscule place on this Ministry of Defence Twitter banner. So it's the UK stands with Ukraine. You would think this was the Ukrainian Ministry of Defence speaking here. But we're just going to say, if you want propaganda, then look no further than at Defence HQ. And to come on to the subject, this is the latest report. I'll just read a bit of it. On the 9th of August 2022, explosions occurred at the Russian-operated Saki military airfield in western Crimea. The original cause of the blast is unclear, but the large mushroom clouds visible in eyewitness video were almost certainly from the detonation of up to 4 uncovered munition storage areas. So interesting, they don't know anything about it, but they seem to be suggesting that they do. And then it goes on to say that at least 5 Su-24 Fencer fighter bombers and 3 Su-30 flanker multi-role jets were almost certainly destroyed. So there's the little word, almost. And it says the loss of 8 combat jets represents a minor proportion of the overall fleet of aircraft Russia has available to support the war. However, Saki was primarily used as a base for the aircraft of the Russian Navy's Black Sea Fleet. And it says that the fleet's naval aviation capability is now significantly degraded. Well, I'm going to say straight away, I don't believe that is true at all, because this is very minor losses for the Russians. It may be inconvenient, but for defense intelligence to make out that this is some major blow to the Russians, I think is just nonsense. If we put that one back on screen, I think we've just got to get the label on here that, of course, they call themselves intelligence, but they're failing to report the true facts of the war. This is hype, and it's pro-Ukrainian hype.
I think on the Ukrainian side, they're desperate for some good news, some encouraging news. Morale is really low. They're losing hundreds of servicemen per day on average, and the losses are just completely off the charts. I mean, anyone's estimation by the end of the month, August, looking
168th day, or is it 69 today? So that's roughly what we're talking about.
30,000 dead by some people's estimations. Yeah. It's very difficult to know because they've stopped keeping count. So this is an information war going on both sides, but especially on the Ukrainian side. And the British are supporting the Ukrainian information war, as are the United States. Yeah. Arguably, they're running the information war from the West, from NATO.
I think that's absolutely correct, Patrick. Now, if we want to find out what's really happening, we're going to have to go to alternative and new media. This is one of the excellent sites that's reporting on what's happening on the battlefield on a day-to-day basis. This is Defence Politics Asia, which I've mentioned before. Very measured analysis where, as things change on the battlefield, it's explained in a very measured way. But the key bit here is that if we have a look at the fronts in Ukraine, we've got heavy fighting down on the south, the Mykolaiv front. We've also got very heavy fighting over in the Donbass. And what we clearly know now is that the Ukrainian southern front strategic counter attack, this is when they were talking about a 1,000,000-men army. This has been exposed as a complete myth. But if you have a look at the diagram that I've got on screen, there's little cross sword symbols showing where fighting is happening in a big way. And while Ministry of Defence UK doesn't want to talk about the battlefield because the reality is the Ukrainians are losing, whether that's a good thing or not, the truth is they're losing. UK's Ministry of Defence simply doesn't want to tell us. So if we bring up a few more images, and at the end of this segment, I'm going to encourage you to actually visit the website and look at the reports for yourself. But Bakhmut is now under intense pressure from the Russians. This is the southernmost key city of yet another Ukrainian defense line, heavily fortified, built up over many years. But the Russians are now moving into the eastern suburb of that city, and Bakhmut will fall. Once the Russians are through this line, it becomes easier for them to move forward to the west. This is a bit more detail on screen of the city area. If you go and look at the original video report, you can actually see this. But what is significant about Bakhmut is that we now know that the Russians, and in particular via the Russian shelling, has broken the Ukrainian defense in depth. And here's another map showing the Russian advances. And this is the reality that across the important sections of the front, the Russians are moving forward. It's being done in a very slow, calculated way, but the British Ministry of Defence does not want to talk about it. We've got capturing of factory plants. This is not a particularly significant factory. Much of it is actually demolished, but nevertheless, it shows that the Russians are moving forward. We've got fighting around Vasily, so this is another area where the Russians are advancing. No reports at all from the BBC or the Ministry of Defence here in UK. And this one here moves us into another critical area, because what is this showing? That the remains of the Ukrainian Air Force are being shot down on a daily, certainly a weekly basis. And here mapped were some of the latest casualties in the Ukrainian Air Force. Now, we encourage everybody watching UK Column to go to the source of the material we're reporting. So this is Defence Politics Asia. You can freeze the screen and have a look at the full address, but we encourage you to go and have a look at this material for yourselves. And of course, one of the reports that is consistent by new media reporting on the war is that the claims by the US and the UK in particular that the HIMARS systems are winning the war for Ukraine is simply nonsense. The reality is that there's too few of these systems, even with UK promising another 3 HIMARS systems to Ukraine to replace losses. There's too many of these systems to really make a difference. So, Patrick, it's outrageous that we should live in supposedly free speech democracy in Western Europe, but we cannot see the truth about this proxy war because our own governments say, no, you're not allowed to look at it.
Yeah, so if you're not getting all the information, if our MPs, our heads of ministries are not getting all the information from all sides, how can they make educated decisions based, to inform their policy decisions?
Yeah.
So in that case, they're consuming their own propaganda. They're in their own echo bubble. And I'm telling you, when you're engaged in a war, like Britain it considers itself to be at war, it's acting as if it's directly involved and at war, that it's joined at the hip with Ukraine and it's fighting with Ukraine, fighting this war. How can you, as an elected representative, make decisions based on a quarter or a half of the information? So this is why censorship doesn't make any sense in this case. Why would you not want to compare what the Russian media sources are saying and compare them to yours in order to sort of get closer to the truth?
Well, surely we would expect our media to be doing this, and certainly the BBC if it's serving the public, but clearly it's not. If I can just pop this one up on the screen. This came through from Alex Thompson yesterday. He'd been listening to BBC Radio 4 NewsHour at about 2 o'clock, and he was with David Scott. He said, I heard the Latvian defense minister say that Russia could have been defeated by now if there had been less talk and more action by the West. That wasn't an exact quote, but that was what he was saying. And of course, this is the type of spin which the BBC, Radio 4 here, but the BBC nevertheless likes to put out.
Is a pointless statement, by the way, but that also speaks to the weaker NATO nations, the Baltic states, relying on the bigger sticks standing behind them, like the United States, for instance, to do all the protecting, the heavy lifting, the fighting. These politicians are all basically on the same page on this with the Ukrainian conflict. And a lot of people aren't actually on their page in those countries. So you have a separation between the political class and what a lot of the people think. And there is a divergence there. That's not being reported
at
in
all.
The Western media.
No. So what does the BBC want to talk about? Well, this one really made me smile because I was sent this via an email. So we've got BBC admits it broke its impartiality rules by broadcasting an interview with Russell T Davies at BAFTAs in which he attacked government plans to scrap the licence fee and sell off Channel 4. And the covering text in the email is, hello, Brian, the BBC say they were biased. Wait for it, because they did not put forward the government agenda on this subject. And this, of course, is the reality that the BBC and the other media, the big media in UK, is about getting the government agenda across. It's not about the truth. And of course, none of them want to get into the horrible reality of the war. This is a little video clip circulating. There's nothing particularly unpleasant that happens in the video clip, but I decided just to put a still up. But we've got a report here that Ivan Zelezniak, if I pronounce that correctly, who was the man who was taunting the mothers of Russian soldiers who'd been killed, he's now been captured in a foxhole, and this is one of the reports. So we're just taking this as a report, but what do I want to stress? Of course, this tells us about the vicious nature of this war, and let's remember that this is a proxy war where the US, the UK, and the EU are now training troops, 10,000 a day in UK, and a minimum of 100 of these troops are going to die every day when they go back to the front line, and they're going to be killed by shelling, possibly without even seeing a Russian serviceman on the battlefield. So this is an utter disgrace. Not a single British politician standing up and saying, let's have a ceasefire, let's get peace on the battlefield and sort this problem out. We're just pumping in the weapons.
Yeah, so they're cycling in 10,000 Ukrainian troops apparently every 120 days for training in the UK. Something tells me, based on the current rate of servicemen lost in Ukraine, that those numbers are going to dwindle. How will they fill up those ranks? Most likely with
old people.
Older soldiers, but
yeah.
They're conscripting really young and really old men in Ukraine, but also mercenaries.
Yeah.
And so this brings us to the topic of mercenaries. And there is an independent British journalist. His name is Graham Phillips. We mentioned him on the program before. He's been sanctioned by the UK government. We'll bring this up on screen. And he's really sanctioned apparently for interviewing a British mercenary in Donbass who was captured. So let's look at what Graham Phillips has posted today or in the last 24 hours on his Telegram channel here. Though this is an email which was sent to him by the BBC. So the BBC apparently are doing a hatchet job on Graham Phillips, who's been sanctioned. His counts. His assets have been frozen. He's persona non grata in the UK. He's a British citizen. He's reporting in Donbass. He's been reporting for 8 years in Donbass. So there's nothing new about Graham Phillips. And so this is what the BBC has sent to him, and we'll comment on this afterwards. Hi, Graham. One more final point. We have spoken to a lawyer who says his chambers here in the UK have been working to gather evidence, which they intend to present to the public prosecutor here in the UK. They told us the following. This is very important legally here. The investigation that we have looked at is a matter of English law. So as a British national, we say that there is jurisdiction for him to be investigated and potentially prosecuted under the Geneva Conventions. You know, there may be circumstances where reasonable journalistic integrity is used to interview a prisoner of war, but one has to look at the circumstances and conditions in which this person is being held. Aidan Aslan, in this case, the British soldier of fortune, the circumstances in which he was arrested and the consequences that he faces being put on trial in what has already been described as a farcical process, apparently here. And they finish off, they're saying, I just wanted to check, given this new information, is there anything further that you felt you wanted to add to your previous emails to us, says the BBC. And Graham provided a screenshot of the actual email here. This is by Chloe Hajimachu there, and this is her email. So she is the journalist apparently doing this hatchet job on Graham Phillips. So they're in contact with lawyers who are preparing a prosecution against Phillips. So the BBC seems to be doing a little more maybe than journalism here.
Well, they're helping the state to progress its agenda. But in simple terms, what have we got? We've got an Englishman who goes to Ukraine, he fights in the war. Many people would say he was doing that in the capacity as a mercenary. He
himself said he was a mercenary.
Okay, he gets captured. He's then allowed by the Russians to put out his own broadcast from his cell, where he's keen to engage with other people who will pick up his story. And when somebody engages with him, the BBC turns around and attacks them. It's outrageous.
Well, Graham was the first to interview him, and since then, Aidan Aslan's been canvassing for interviews. He's touting for interviews. So he's basically saying pretty much the same thing in these other interviews as that he told Graham Phillips in the initial interview. So he sought out Graham Phillips. He wanted him to interview him. Graham interviewed him, and that's when all hell broke loose, and it was brought up on the floor of the House of Commons.
Yeah.
So, and you know, I want to get Vanessa's comment very quickly. Vanessa, this BBC journalist, the name sounds familiar. Can you just remind me of what she has done recently in her journalistic endeavors?
Oh, well, I mean, Chloe Hadjimatiu was the so-called journalist who produced the Mayday series to effectively try and discredit predominantly myself, of course, anyone who had exposed the white helmets since their establishment in 2013. But what is interesting is, yes, she is clearly employed, I would suggest, by not only the BBC, but by intelligence agencies. And that was a conclusion we came to after the various backwards and forwards with questions and answers between myself and the academic working group on Syria media and propaganda, etc., that she was being coached in her answers. And of course, the BBC and Chloe Hadjimatyu's article on the sting operation carried out against Paul McKeague, one of the academics in the working group, resulted in my detention at Heathrow for.
We lost. Well, okay, that's a shame. We'll see whether we can get Vanessa back. That's always the risk of a outside line.
We'll reconnect with her, but just here's Graham Phillips's response. We'll bring this up on screen as well, and this is what he says in response. So the BBC have put some lawyer up to trying. This is his view here, trying to put together a private case against me to pressure the UK public prosecutor into pressing charges against me in a UK court.
I'm laughing, Patrick, because how can the BBC dare to say that one of its key attributes is that it's unbiased?
or
impartial,
impartial, objective.
Yeah.
It seems like they're actively involved in an outcome here.
Yes.
That's a legal outcome. That's just our view of this. This is on Graham Phillips's Telegram channel here, and he goes on. Then, if that goes to a UK court of law and I were found guilty, I'd get a criminal punishment. However, without getting any court of law, the UK government have already given me a criminal punishment. Sanctions. He's been sanctioned without any due process other than a stroke of the pen by, it looks like, the foreign Commonwealth officers of the foreign ministry under Liz Truss.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So, and he goes on here. So, if found guilty, I would already have served my punishment sanctions or get another one on top of that, he asks. And he finally rounds this off. I just don't know how, quote, British justice works anymore, says Graham Phillips.
Yeah, well, that is a good question, but it's not a good question, because the moment you ask that question, you're showing that either you're putting a rhetorical question across or you don't understand the reality of UK, and that is that justice does not exist anymore. Justice is simply the will of the state in this country.
So the question we're posing at the end of this segment here on this, and I will get Vanessa's comment because she got cut off. We're going to bring her back in a second. The question is, why target Graham Phillips specifically, a British citizen and independent journalist? He was sanctioned by Liz Truss's ministry. Okay, he's interviewing a British mercenary. And a lot of people have put two and two together much earlier and saying, hey, wait a minute, isn't it Liz Truss who said that she supports mercenaries going to Ukraine, where she had to walk that statement back? So knowing that she was going to be a front runner for the Tory leadership, is this attack on Graham Phillips to deflect or defend Liz Truss in the run-up to the Tory leadership race?
Because we could have a prime minister, we could have that woman as a prime minister who has promoted mercenaries.
So is this politically motivated?
Yeah, possibly.
Is this part of a sort of upper echelon Tory effort to protect their heir apparent?
I think this is highly likely. And of course, the secondary thing is that if Graham Phillips goes down, then anybody who dares comment about what's really happening on the mercenary front or the war in Ukraine front gets the same British justice. Vanessa, welcome back.
I don't know what happened. I froze, I think. Where did I get up to?
You were explaining about Chloe Hadjimatheou.
Yeah, okay, well, I'll shorten it. I mean, basically, Chloe Hadjimatheou was hauled over the coals after her BBC Mayday series investigating the claims against the White Helmets by Peter Hitchens, who had his complaint to the Ombudsman upheld against the BBC because Hadjimatheou had claimed that one of the OPCW whistleblowers had received $100,000 or pounds incentive from WikiLeaks to counter the OPCW corrupted report on the alleged, now disproven, Douma chemical attack in 2018 in Syria. So Hadjimatheou has a track record. I would suggest that the lawyer that is working with her is Toby Cadman, who also, of Guernica Chambers, who also has a record of being funded by the UK Foreign Office to lead prosecutions against adversary states like Syria and like Russia, and who has worked closely with Chloe Hadjimatheou and the BBC. And I would also point out that there are now Ukrainian organizations springing up in the UK that are have on their websites kill lists similar to the Ukrainian ones. It was reported by Steve Sweeney at Morning Star and a number of other outlets. One organization called Molfar, based in London, that has an ORC kill list and is identifying Russians that they claim were involved in the Bucha massacre. So, the UK is going full hog now, basically. It's targeting journalists, and it now has its own Ukrainian kill list on British territory.
And she won an award, a journalist award, for her BBC Radio 4 series, right? And that was...
Yeah. She won an award. Well, I'm not sure she won it. She was shortlisted. I had a quick look. She was shortlisted in 2021 for the George Orwell Prize, which is wonderfully ironic.
And Vanessa would just add in for people who still might not know that, of course, the BBC's own charity, BBC Media Action, was instrumental in constructing the the Ukrainian state media. So effectively, the BBC, they're fully in control of what is coming out of Ukraine. And if you're dealing with the BBC and BBC Media Action, you're dealing with BBC monitoring, and that provides the connection through to the UK security services. So a proxy war being run with money and weapons coming in from the West, but we even control the media coming out of Ukraine. Phenomenal. What have we got on oil, Patrick?
Well, let's go to the energy sector, and talking about the Ukrainian war, the sanctions that were put on Russia were supposed to basically hobble Moscow and cut its war machine down so it can't fund its war of aggression in Ukraine. So that was the plan back in the end of February, early March.
Yeah.
Let's look at the results. And the results are as follows. Russian oil and gas revenues help current account surplus more than triple, 167 billion. That's up from over 50 billion for the same time a year earlier, according to central bank data. So record revenues for Russia in oil and gas after the war, okay? So revenue growth driven by new Asian customers. So they're trying to cut off supplies from Europe and the West to balkanize the markets, and the result is Russia's had a bumper year for energy sales.
Yeah.
So I guess that went really well, the sanctions, yeah?
Or perhaps not. I mean, this is not cutting off your nose to spite your face. This is removing the whole of your lower torso as the US and the European Union go into recession as a result of these policies.
And we get hit with record expensive energy bills per month. Households paying up to 500 expected this winter, and they just announced it's going to double again.
Yeah.
Where does this end? When do these policies get rolled back and we get back to normal markets?
I'm going to say I believe it ends when the economies in the West are destroyed, because that is when the real political agenda is going to show itself. But we'll save that for another time.
And so the UK has had a little profit center out of all these sanctions. They've been exporting LNG or natural gas that they've converted in the UK. They've been getting it from Qatar, and they're exporting it to Europe. They're selling it to Europe at a premium, okay? This is interesting. So there's benefits from these sanctions for certain UK companies, but here's the problem. This was reported in the Financial Times in the last couple of days. Energy companies urge UK to detoxify gas exports to the EU. Here's a summary. EU energy companies complained that the LNG processed in the UK for export to the European bloc has toxic and hazardous contaminants, including radioactive material. And they go on here. The National Grid has reportedly applied to the UK energy regulator Ofgem to temporarily increase the volume of its gas imports to mainland Europe via the pipeline, subsea pipeline there to the Netherlands, but Interconnector Limited, which operates the pipeline between the UK and Belgium, has they're surprised by the plan, Brian, as the supplies have been consistently contaminated, causing 2 shutdowns at the pipeline for repairs. And finally, Interconnector says the gas is filled with hazardous, toxic, radioactive materials, and any increase in gas volumes of this quality would exacerbate the problem, lead to increased risks, disruption of cross-border flows, risking both European and Great British security of supply. So not going so well. Now, there are hazardous materials normally in these gas flows, so they're saying the levels have skyrocketed because they're not doing the maintenance, they're not reinvesting. It's not fit for purpose, basically. It needs a lot of work and a lot of inward investment into this to fix and repair it.
It's incredible, all these problems suddenly occurring at this one point in time. Well, Vanessa, let's bring you in, because you've also been having a look at what's been happening with oil in Syria.
The famous oil in Syria. So first of all, a little video that was just released a couple of days ago showing, I mean, we've seen it many times, but showing a US convoy taking, I think, around 40 tankers of fuel out of Syria and into the various smuggling routes. I don't know if the video is playing or it's frozen.
No, it's going to come up on screen. Just
oh, okay.
We should be able to. We should be.
Going on for a very long time, since the beginning of the war against Syria in 2011, and through all administrations, so from Obama through to Trump now, and now with Biden. And so on the day that the video came out and was published, the Ministry of Oil and Mineral Resources in Syria put out a statement saying that Syrian oil production during the first half of 2022 amounted to some 14.5 million barrels, with an average daily production of 80.3 thousand barrels. This is obviously in the northeast, which is occupied by United States military, but also all the coalition members, so the UK, EU member states, etc. US occupation forces and Kurdish Contras, those are my words, by the way, steal up to 66,000 barrels every single day. So every single day, the US effectively is stealing around 83% of Syrian oil production. But what I wanted to do today is to go through, to some degree, the history of the oil theft in Syria, and for people to fully understand what this means, because we're talking there about what is it? About 83, about 17% that is, one assumes, is then available to Syria. But I'm going to explain that that's not quite how it works. So back in 2016, people might remember Bayrat al-Bayrat, who's the son-in-law of President Recep Erdogan of Turkey. In 2016, WikiLeaks revealed 57,000 emails which were hacked over a period of 6 years, demonstrating that he was then Minister of Oil, the son-in-law of President Erdogan, was effectively running the smuggled oil from Syria through Turkey from ISIS at that point. So at that point, ISIS had control of the Syrian oil resources. Of course, ISIS is proven to be another United States, Washington proxy in Syria. Just to give an idea of where the oil was transported to, and this is where we start to understand how complex this situation. So the crude is transported from ISIS by tankers to Jordan via Anbar province, to Iran via Kurdistan, and I will explain that before people start jumping up and down, to Turkey via Mosul in Iraq, and to Syria's local market, but I will get further into that also as I go on, and to the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So effectively, what ISIS and now the Kurdish Contras and the US occupying forces are doing is smuggling Syrian oil out of Syria. Now, this was a map that was produced by the Financial Times in 2016, and again, it's showing the ISIS export of oil. To the left, you see with the first arrow, those are the smuggling routes into Turkey. And in fact, Erdogan's son-in-law was selling that oil to Israel. There is a very strong possibility, there are various reports out there discussing it, that some of the Syrian oil was sent into Europe. So while Europe is sanctioning and blockading and besieging Syria, it's happily accepting produce from inside Syria, like, for example, pistachios from Aleppo, traded by the terrorist groups that were then occupying Aleppo at zero tax to France. Now, at the same time, under the Trump administration, a little-known US firm secures deal for Syrian oil. Now, just bear in mind how ridiculous this is. An American company that was given a license by the Trump administration, established, incorporated in Delaware in February 2019. Partners include former US ambassador to Denmark, James Kane, James Reese, a former officer in the Army's elite Delta Force, and John P. Derrier Jr., a former executive at Gulf Sands Petroleum, a UK-based company with offices and drilling experience in Syria. An American company has inked a contract with Kurdish authorities in northeastern Syria to develop and export the region's crude oil under a secretive deal approved by the US government months after Donald Trump announced he was leaving US troops to secure the oil. Now, it's worth saying here that every single US administration has been very clear that they are in Syria, amongst other things, to steal the resources. Delta Crescent operates under the protection of the Kurdish Contras and the US military. So while it achieves some degree of plausible deniability for the State Department, it is, however, fully linked and connected to the State Department. Pentagon spokesperson noted that the Department of Defense does not have an affiliation with any private companies in regard to the oil fields in northeast Syria, but we've just proven that there is a former military operative as one of the operating officers of Delta. And going on down, the company's plan is to sell Syrian oil to various customers in the region, potentially including Assad. Well, that's very nice of them to sell Syrian oil to the legitimate Syrian government. Turkish-backed, I would replace that with terrorists, and Iraqi Kurdistan, all of whom could then sell it on the international market. So effectively, this is what is happening. Syrian oil is being smuggled out of Syria, and even within Syria, it is petroleum warlords and smugglers who are then selling the oil to the Syrian government. So that's where I'm coming back to this idea that Syria gets 17% of its own oil production. No, it doesn't. It has to buy that 17% from smugglers, terrorists like ISIS and like Al Qaeda. We'll get onto that. And this is a 2021 Washington Institute report. So this is now under the Biden administration. Now, in April of 2021, Biden made, a little bit of smoke and mirrors. He said that he was going to shut down the Delta Crescent operation because it had been established by Trump. But in fact, in this report, the Biden administration has quietly granted it several temporary extensions since April. So since he said this operation would shut down, the extensions have been given. Now, why is this important? Because in the same report, the dangers of allowing an oil vacuum. Now, what effectively, people can freeze this screen later and they can read it at their own leisure. But effectively, what they are saying here, because pre-2011, it was actually Russia, through their own Gulf Sands Petroleum, that was controlling much of the oil production and trade in the Northeast. People might be surprised by that. Remember, this war started because President Assad wouldn't abandon its alliance with Russia over the oil pipeline. And basically, the US biggest fear is if they withdraw from the Northeast and from the control of the oil, they will open up the potential to oil flowing back to the Syrian people, to the Syrian government, and alleviating the barbaric effects of the sanctions that the US has imposed on Syria. But this is where it gets interesting, because who else is effectively processing the oil that's being stolen by Washington's proxies in Syria? None other than HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the next slide, effectively, formerly Nusra Front, al-Qaeda in Syria. And here again, it's a 2021 report in a sort of local media. It's the existence of Watad, the al-Qaeda controlled processing operation, is not reported in mainstream media. You won't find it in the BBC. But if we have a look at the next map, which again, I want to point out, this is a map showing the control of the region now. The blue section is HTS. The arrow is pointing to a Kurdish-controlled area to the west of Aleppo and bordering on al-Qaeda territory and on Turkish Contra territory. And then if we move on, you'll see the smuggling routes from that Kurdish sector into the Watad operations. And I've been told in the last 2 days that Watad now has created various franchises, smaller operations, but that Watad, so Al-Qaeda, has monopoly over the processing of Syrian oil. And that will go through the same smuggling routes that you saw that previously were being described by the UN as humanitarian border crossings into Turkey and then to the various markets that I described. When I mentioned Iran, by the way, Iran, as in the Iranian government, is not buying Syrian oil, but Iranian smugglers are buying the oil and are then potentially reselling it back to Syria. So just to give you an idea of the extent to which, through the US occupation of this territory, Syria has really lost control of its resources. And here, when it's talking about price increases, I want people to understand this. So Al-Qaeda, if you look at the first one, top tier imported gasoline in Idlib, right? $15 per 20 liters. Second tier, $8.50 per 20 liters. I'm putting it like that because that's how we calculate it here in Syria, because we have a limit of only 20 liters of fuel per month. We have smart cards. We can only use 20 liters per month. I mean, imagine how little that is. But also back in December 2021, where these prices were published, roughly Syrians were paying the $15 per 20 liters for the second tier quality. So that gives you an idea of how much Syria is being penalized by the operations of US, UK, EU proxies inside Syria, including, of course, their assets. Al-Qaeda, described as such by Jake Sullivan to Hillary Clinton and by Ambassador Jeffries, Mike Pompeo's point man on Syria, as being their asset in Syria. And what Syria has to deal with, of course, are almost daily fuel queues, sometimes up to 24 hours, 48 hours, to be able to get their 20 liters at an extortionate rate. So I just wanted to do this just to give a better insight into how criminal the US occupation is of that northeastern territory.
Really excellent analysis. Thank you very much for that. As you were talking it through, I'm thinking what Vanessa's really describing here is, of course, a criminal international cartel which is at work. And of course, it can only do the stealing of the oil on this scale if it's fully backed by in particular by the US, but also the Western military. And we've now really got a parallel system starting to happen in Ukraine. So we really need to be thinking about who's running the show. Is this being run by individual countries? Is the US in charge of what's happening here? Or is it actually the commercial global companies that have got sufficient clout to run the criminal activity? I think it's the latter.
Yeah, and the precursor on that ISIS oil trade with Turkey, Genel Energy, who've since been absorbed into a larger conglomerate, and that was Tony Hayward of BP fame, and I believe one of the Nat Rothschild, one of the Rothschilds was his partner in that, and a Turkish partner as well. So that Genel Energy, in the early on with that ISIS oil trade, that's those are known players in the British energy market as well.
Immensely powerful people. We need to lift the stones and see what's happening. Well, if you like what UK Column is doing, please support us. Take out a membership and join us, join the community, find out what other people, like-minded people, are saying. Also, you can support us by coming into the shop and buying some of the excellent products. So here we've got t-shirts and, of course, the logoed UK Column bags, but also the pens and badges are going extremely well. And as we say, the pen is mightier than the sword. So why not do the damage with your local politician with a UK Column pen and an appropriate letter? And of course, please share our material, because the further we can spread the facts and the truth, the better it is. Now, I want to really push for people to pay attention to the AV12. which is coming up in September. You can go to that web address to get to the details. UK Column is facilitating this by allowing it to be streamed live. It will be run through the UK Column studio, but the idea is to help kickstart the wonderful alternative view productions so that ultimately we can get back to bringing very large numbers of people together in a hotel venue. So if you're not signed up to this one, please do that, because this will help us get the major events coming back on stream. And I also want to give a little bit of a shout out here to Louise Collins from Liberty Tactics. Louise at the weekend has got a tremendous event which she has created in order to support the wonderful ladies in Wales who have been fighting the Welsh government over this appalling religious and sex education. So this is simply allowing people to speak out. It's coupled with music, but the whole idea